Okay, we'll get started. Okay, so my name's Paige. I'm a runner. I do some work with Wild Places as well. This session's going to be a bit about nutrition around endurance sport, with a focus on running. And today we've got Mick Chapman here, or Chapo, and he's got, as well as having a background in endurance sport and still participating in it very much so. He's got a background in public health nutrition. So he's pretty good at giving us all some info about this sort of stuff. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all gathering from today, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. Today I'm on Yuin country, and feel free to let us know where you're coming to us from in the chat box too. Right, so Chapo, are you good to get going?
Good to go. I'll just make sure I can actually share my screen. So can you guys see that?
I can.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so today hopefully is just a bit of a deep dive into some nutrition strategies and concepts when it comes to kind of endurance running, and we'll touch on different aspects of that based on different distances or demands on the body, and kind of what that means day to day, as well as within a race, so or within those longer training sessions. So hopefully this works where I can actually click through. Can you guys see the second slide?
Yeah, and if anyone's got questions, feel free to put your hand up or put it in the chat box.
Yeah, if we've got a bit of a smaller group here, feel free to just shout out along the way, because I'm more than happy to answer questions along the way. So the majority of this presentation will be centered around questions, and if they pose more questions, feel free to ask them along the way. Hopefully make this as informative as possible for you guys, and hopefully you can take a fair bit away from it. So just a little bit about where I've come from. As Paige said, I've done a lot myself in that endurance space. Really fascinated by what the body is capable of doing. So that's where my passion lies. And then kind of more professionally in the nutrition and public health space. So really enjoy helping people out in regards to what whether that's performance and what people are capable of doing, or whether that's more kind of holistic as a population group to get our population having healthier behaviors long term. So I'd say they're my two passions, and this kind of presentation, or these kind of topics, really sit in the middle there, where you can potentially create some really interesting discussions with people, but also we can dive down into what our bodies are capable of, and how do we kind of tap into those those added benefits, so we can get the most out of our running when we're out on trails. So Paige has just flicked through a few kind of introductory questions to jump into. And as I said, feel free to ask questions along the way. But the first one is in regards to what you should eat before training. So as I mentioned, hopefully this will bring out a fair bit in regards to where nutrition sits in the science space, as well as what works for you, and hopefully with a lot of the discussion that you guys can actually pull out aspects of what you do currently, and potentially question some areas of it, or say that, yeah, I think that I'm on the right track with certain things that I'm doing. So and that's the beauty of these kind of discussions, right? So in regards to what you should eat before training, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the individual aspects of what that means, but as a whole, and this will be quite a big theme throughout, that carbohydrates are kind of king when it comes to fueling. There's a lot of chat in different spaces around different fuel sources, and we'll dive into that, as I said, in a tick. But what you should be eating before you're doing a training session or before a longer run. Kind of depends on the intensity of it as well as the length of the session. So the more intense or the longer the session goes, the more likely you are to be relying on carbohydrates. And I would say for majority of sports, including endurance running, carbohydrates is kind of where you should be looking. So not only carbohydrates, but I'd say in the lead up to a key training session or a key event, not just solely relying on carbohydrates, or not focusing too heavily on one aspect of that preparation. Looking at kind of sleep a couple of days prior to, carbohydrate loading can happen up to 72 hours before a race or a training session. So really stocking up those kind of fuel cells before we get started on a training session, as well as making sure you're well hydrated and sleeping. So making sure you're topping up every aspect of what you can potentially lay down in a training session or a race, and a lot of that is to do with the big percentage plays, I guess, which is kind of sleep and nutrition. It's fascinating sometimes that people will be able to tell you what their Whoop score is, or tell you that they can last 3 minutes in an ice bath, but they'll have no idea about what carbohydrate intake they would have before a training session, or how many carbs per hour they are actually intaking throughout a session. And it's quite baffling that we deep dive into kind of the different aspects of, say, our running shoes, and what they cost and what that means in terms of our output, but we don't put near as much effort or energy into our nutrition. And arguably it's a bigger area, or it can really either make or break your day if you haven't planned it right. So what you're eating before a training or training session or a race is really crucial to how that training session or race pans out for you. So knowing that carbohydrate is king, and loading up to 72 hours prior, that doesn't mean absolutely throwing everything into your face. If you can try and avoid things higher in saturated fat as well as higher in fiber, you're actually going to be benefiting your gut before a session, which is really good. So making sure we don't think that carbohydrates just means throwing everything out the window and loading up on absolutely everything, but just trying to get some good quality carbohydrates in before a session. And knowing that carbohydrate loading starts 72 hours, not just the night before. Just touching on that, and we'll reference to it a little bit later on in terms of what works for you. When I was training for my first Ironman, I was doing a lot of kind of research into what other people were doing in that space, and I was quite young at the time, but I was researching Craig Alexander, who's won multiple Kona championships, and they asked the question what he eats the night before a race, and he said that it was lasagna, and he was like, there's no real background to that. He said it just reminds me of home and I enjoy the food. So it's funny how people look at whoever's coming first in a race and note down exactly what they're intaking, and it just might work for them. So finding what works for you is really beneficial, and that's actually our second question. But before we touch on that, this next slide is really puts it into perspective, and kind of dives down into the science a little bit into this space. Pretty much, if your sessions are going to be above kind of 60 or 65% of intensity, which most are, then, as I said, carbohydrates are king. They're really beneficial. And as you can see in this slide here with the graphs, is that pretty much the higher the intensity gets, the more we rely on carbohydrates. But the two main fuel sources of fats and carbohydrates have different ways of, or different pathways, I guess. So carbohydrates can deplete quite easily, and they usually deplete within 60 to 90 minutes of starting a session, depending on the intensity. So that's why we need to, throughout a race or throughout a training session, to continuously top that up, because otherwise that's what we get that's called, hitting the wall, which I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, where you kind of just absolutely bonk out and you have to drop the pace right back. And that's actually the difference between being in a carbohydrate-rich fuel source to being depleted. And as I said, as the intensity, you actually need to drop your intensity to drop back to using fats as a fuel source then, because you've depleted your carbohydrate fuel source. So now it's time to use fats as a fuel source, but the intensity cannot be as high. So that's why when you bonk out, or when you hit that wall, your body says, all right, let's slow this right back, because we need to utilize, if you're going to keep going, we're going to need to utilize a different fuel source, which is fats. And a lot of people talk about, I don't know if people have heard before about being kind of fat adapted or kind of training fasted. These can be beneficial for longer endurance events, and some people do rely on that. I wouldn't say relying solely on that would be a wise move, but definitely playing around with where that sits with you would really help out. So what that means is that if you're doing a long, slow run that doesn't have big spikes in heart rate or anything, then you can probably afford to not have as much carbohydrates in the system. And when you do that, you kind of train your body to be better at using fat as an energy source, I guess. The only caveats to that is the fact that carbohydrates are always number one. And you think if you're doing a trail event, it's more than likely that a few factors are going to actually increase your intensity without you even having too much control over it, whether that's suddenly running up a mountain that's a hilly course, or that you want to kind of sprint finish to the end. If you're relying solely on fat as a fuel source at that point, your body's not going to have a good time in doing that. So you can play around with using fat as a fuel source in training, but just be mindful that your intensity probably can't go above about 65%, otherwise you're going to have a bad time. So that kind of explains the different fuel sources that we have. Protein can be a fuel source, but that is when you are in a very, very bad way. You've depleted both of those fuel sources, and it's starting to kind of eat away at your muscles. That's when you see people at the end of I guess an Ironman or a long distance event where they're absolutely spent on all fours. They are in a very bad state. So if you're ever using protein as a fuel source, probably hospital is the next best bet for when you wrap up that race. So carbohydrates is number one. Fats is a good backup system, and proteins probably shouldn't ever be touched, hopefully. But they are quite beneficial in terms of the recovery, as you probably are aware of.
Hey Mick, can I
yes.
ask two questions? You spoke about if you were training fasted. Is there, like, if someone was training fasted, like how long would you say is the maximum they should do that before they start to take in some carbohydrate?
Yeah, it depends on the intensity of the session. If the intensity of the session is quite low and you know it's going to be low, you can play with that, and it's interesting to do. But in terms of how long, our bodies are amazing at what they do, and the more you dive into it, the more there is to learn. But pretty much as soon as we have a meal post event, even if we are training fasted, as soon as we have a meal straight away, we convert straight back to our primary fuel source, which is carbohydrates. So I would only play with training fasted on very few occasions. If you've got a long build to a race or something in 10 weeks, play around with it potentially every now and then. You know, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, but I wouldn't be relying on it too much. And a lot of the rhetoric around training fasted isn't in the running or endurance world. It's more in that fitness industry. And there's a lot of chat around, I guess, weight loss and fat burning. And where people get confused with that is there's a difference between fat as an energy system or an energy fuel source and fat as part of our body, right? So, or kind of adipose tissue. So people assume that they're the exact same thing, but as I was just talking about then, once we eat a meal post session, even if we've trained fasted, as soon as we go back to eating, our body goes back to our primary fuel source, which is carbohydrates, which is what we kind of want it to do. People assume that fat oxidation is when we're using fat as a fuel source, which is what I was just talking about before. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are losing weight. People put those two things together straight away. Because we're fat oxidizing or using fat as a fuel source, that means I'm going to lose weight because obviously fat, right? But it's not the case, because as soon as we have a meal, our body starts switching back. So when we train fasted in that session, it's probably we are more than likely using fat as a fuel source. And then for the rest of the day, we'll probably use carbohydrates as a fuel, when we're running, when we're just going about our day-to-day business, carbohydrates will be that fuel source. When we train with, after say, carbo loading, that's when we use carbohydrates as a fuel source in that session, and it's likely that we'll use some sort of fat oxidation later on in the day as well. So those two systems kind of balance each other out without us even thinking about it. So to answer your question, I probably wouldn't use it every single session. If your intensity is going above 65%, carbs are always the way to go.
Thanks, mate. And
did that answer it? I hope it did.
Yeah, no. And just Jack put in a question, and he said,
"Oh yes,
what's the best way to work out how many carbs per hour I'm burning in a training session?"
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me just see what our next. Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is something that I'd say the biggest thing in sports nutrition is putting together kind of what I call the art versus the science, right? So there's a science that gives us rough guidelines of what we should be consuming before, during, and after a session. And then there's the art of it, which is like, these are the guidelines, but this is what works for me, and this is the food that works for me. So that's what we need to do a lot of trial and error around. And we want to make sure that, and this is what I always talk about with one-on-one clients, is that instead of us finishing a race and going, oh, well, I'll just throw all that out the window because I don't know what went wrong. I started the race, it went to shit and I didn't finish, or I finished really poorly. I don't know what went wrong. So instead of doing that, it's about unpacking what didn't work, and whether that's shoes or whether that's race strategy or the weather or nutrition, which is a huge portion of overall racing or training. You really want to narrow down the window of error, and you go, okay, well, I knew that I had this exact thing at that point, and probably 45 minutes to an hour later, my gut was upset, and I've never tried that thing before. My gut was upset. That was the only new thing that happened. So let's play with that again. next time and see if that happens again. So it's about doing that trial and error. But to answer your question in regards to carbs per hour, carbs per hour is probably the best way of looking at fueling. And the best analogy that I have in regards to overall fueling is that you've got, in any given session, you've got 3 levers. So if anyone's ever sat in like an excavator or a, heavy machinery, there's usually like a couple of levers in front of you. So picture that when you're out running, you've got 3 levers. So one is fluids, one is electrolytes, and one is carbohydrates. So those 3 levers is what you want to play with as you're out there racing or training. And I guess there's different ways of intaking that. So you can either have like something like a tailwind that kind of has a bit of everything, right? So it has your fluids, you'll have your electrolytes, and it'll have your carbohydrates. So you're pulling all 3 levers at the same time in that one product. But what you've got to be careful of is then those products aren't separated. So if the weather starts to get really hot and really humid and you need more water intake, you're actually going to be increasing your water intake, electrolyte intake, and carbohydrate intake, which sometimes can lead to gut irritability, or that mouthfeel where you're like, I just can't have any more of this drink because I'm trying to get my water in because it's so hot out here today, but I'm overloading now on my carbohydrate intake. So those 3 levers can either come in one package, and some people utilize that really well, or it can come in different forms. So you can literally have your water separate to an electrolyte drink, separate to carbohydrate gel. So those 3 levers are what you want to kind of play with and figure out when you're out there. So in regards to carbs per hour, we want to be looking at the baseline for carbohydrate intake is around 30 grams. So once we kind of hit that 60 to 90 minutes, we're starting to be depleted, which means we need to top up before that 60 or 90 minutes to make sure that there's no lag time between then and when we kind of bonk out or lose our carbohydrates. So 30 grams is like a cutoff period. Most people can tolerate around about 60 grams of carbohydrates in an hour. And then some of the elite athletes in different sports can intake anywhere from kind of 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That's in the extreme case, and the limiting factor of getting that high for certain people is kind of the gut irritability of carbohydrates. So if you're smashing carbohydrates consistently and you haven't really trained your gut to that point, you're going to get sick or you're going to have some gut issues there. So I would recommend training your gut in your training sessions to push that ceiling of what you're actually capable of intaking in a session, because the more you can actually intake, the better off you're going to be, especially if that session goes longer or is more intense. So always keep those 2 things in mind, the length of the session or the length of the race and the intensity that it's going to be at, because those 2 things, the longer it goes or the more intense, we're going to get more benefit based on how many grams of carbohydrates per hour we can actually intake without having gut irritability. In regards to your actual question, like what's the best way to work out how many carbs per hour you're actually burning in training? Probably a hard thing to do day to day in terms of the direct numbers, but what I would start to do is figure out what you're intaking, because I would say a lot of people have no idea what they'd actually intake within an hour. Gels have a very, variable rate of carbohydrates. We just go, oh, well, the gels, they all kind of look the same or whatever. So, but some have 15 grams of carbohydrates in a gel, and then some have up to 90 in the same gel. So in our heads, we're kind of like, oh, well, I'm fueling, like I've just taken this in. And in a race scenario, if your first checkpoint is at, say, 15 kilometers and your next checkpoint is at 35 kilometers and you've only taken one gel at checkpoint 1 that was worth 15 grams, you're not going to have a good time for the rest of that race. And you go, what went wrong there? It's probably because you haven't actually understood how many grams of carbohydrates was in that gel. So I'd start by understanding what you can actually intake rather than trying to figure out what your numbers are. Do that trial and error to go, well, I have on my long Sunday run, I've taken in 45 grams of carbohydrates. My guts were okay with that. I found that I performed quite well. It was a good session. Tick that off, figure out what worked with that session. And as I said, reduce that margin for error. So next time you go out, you're like, oh, okay, well, that 45 worked. Today's a little bit hotter. I didn't get as much sleep last night. Where do I sit now with the same scenario? So it's about trial and error, I'd say, and that's probably not the best answer, but it's how it's done, and that's the difference between the art versus science. Science will tell you so much, and then the art of what works for all of us is going to be completely different. Did a study at UTA for nutrition intake for I forget, 26 athletes, I think, and the range in what people intake was wild. It was from one person doing just Morton gels for a full 100 to someone eating pickle and ham sandwiches because that was their vibe. So it's kind of what works for you, and both of those things tick the right boxes in terms of the science, in terms of those 3 levers of I guess, water, sodium, and carbohydrates, but it's just in different forms and what people are used to. So definitely not trying things new on race day, and making sure that you're comfortable in what you're intaking before a race or a big event is really crucial, because a lot of people don't do it. They don't understand what they're intaking. They'll just kind of take stuff on and hope for the best. And you really, there's a lot of wiggle room for you to bring that down to understand exactly what you're intaking. And I'd say a lot of athletes don't do that currently. But yeah, it's a lot of there's a lot of potential there, is what I'd say, with a lot of recreational runners or runners that, majority of people that take to UTA will have a rough idea. But if you ask every single runner at the end of UTA what was their carbohydrate intake per hour, or I'd say that 75% of them wouldn't have a clue the exact number that they intook. So you think UTA would be like everyone would know exactly what's happening, but again, it's trial and error. People are using that race to do well for themselves, but also to figure out what works. And there's a really good saying, you either win or you learn. And I really like that, because majority of the time we don't win races. Like, we can't win every single race. So if you're not winning, what are you taking away from that race? And especially for those longer trail running events, there's a lot that we can take out of those, because there's so many variables. So hopefully that answers your question, Jack, as well as kind of what works for you. I'd say the biggest thing there is trading off the difference between the art of it versus the science. And feel free to just keep throwing in those questions as well. So the next question is, how much do you eat for the rest of the day? So this is a really good question, and it depends on what's happening in the next 24 hours as well. But the four main things that we want to focus on post-event or post-training session is water repletion, electrolyte repletion, carbohydrates, and protein. So those 4 things, if you're ticking those 4 things off, it kind of doesn't matter which form it comes in. If you're ticking those 4 things off, you're doing pretty well to be setting yourself up for recovery, I'd say. So in regards to how much do you eat for the rest of the day, it's highly variable depending on the size of the athlete, how hot it was that day. But everyone will have their rough idea of kind of what does work for them post-race, and kind of then how you feel in the next 24 hours. It's not crucial that you have things directly after a race, but it does help slightly. If you can get carbohydrates in relatively soon after, you're going to be setting yourself up well. But in saying that, if you need to jump straight in the car and get home or whatever, as long as you're getting a decent kind of meal in within the 2 hours post event, then you're doing pretty well. And I'd say a big thing about post event, we think a lot about during the event, they're like, oh, I've got to make sure I'm hydrated throughout the event and keep drinking water, blah, blah, blah. The more switched on you are as an athlete, the more you will appreciate recovery. And a lot of that is in regards to making sure that your water intake reaches a point where you were before your race. And an interesting way of doing that is, if anyone has any scales at home, is to weigh yourself before a session, come home and weigh yourself directly after a session. And usually in terms of weight loss, a lot of that weight loss will be, or majority of that weight loss will be from water. So trying to get yourself back to that weight through drinking water is a really, it's just one way of repleting kind of what you lost throughout that session. And I guess water and electrolytes go hand in hand, because when we sweat, we don't just lose water, we're losing a lot of our minerals as well. So topping those back up is going to be really, really beneficial for us long term. So yeah, focusing on those 4 things is water, electrolytes, carbohydrates, and protein. If we focus on those 4 things post-event, we're going to set ourselves up really well for recovery. A lot of other things come into recovery as well, but from a nutrition standpoint, those 4 things. And what else was I going to put in there? Oh, the other thing is in regards to caffeine. Caffeine actually helps enhance carbohydrate regeneration, I guess. So having a coffee or something caffeinated after an event also helps. And I guess that's something I didn't mention at the start, is in regards to leading up to an event or during an event, caffeine, if you choose to take it, is seen as an ergogenic aid, which kind of means it's for lack of a better phrase, a legal performance enhancer. So if you're not playing around with caffeine and performance is something that you're really looking for, then playing around with caffeine can really be beneficial. So having about 90 milligrams 30 to 90 minutes prior to a session, and then trying to top that up throughout kind of each hour is going to be beneficial for a session. So not carbohydrates, caffeine, it inhibits the kind of sleepiness that we get, but it also has an effect on our rate of perceived exertion. So we can do the same session with caffeine in our system, and the way that we think about how we're being the resources, or the way that it's taxing our body, we think that it's actually less. So there is benefit to having caffeine in and around training as well. And the only other thing that I was going to touch on, I'll answer that question in the chat in a sec, but the only other thing in regards to eating for the rest of the day, there is science around like antioxidants. So getting good food, good whole foods in post session is going to be really beneficial, because what we do throughout a training session or a race is quite stressful on the body, and the best if we can give our body a bit of a leg up by providing antioxidants post session with kind of mainly our fruit and veg. If we can get in that post session as well at some point throughout the next 24 hours, it's going to be beneficial as well. Everyone seems to be really keen on the coffee idea, so I'm glad about that. Nothing new. So this is kind of like, this is a big question, and it's good to see Paige drinking while she reads that question as well. So how much do you need to drink throughout an event, but also day to day? Like as an athlete, day to day, probably the best way of describing water intake is less to do with like liters, because we're all different sizes and shapes, and it's more to do with your output. So if you've got like it's a light straw colored wheat, then that's kind of like the place that you want to be for being well hydrated day to day anyway. So that's a good indicator, rather than going, oh well, I drank 4 liters and Paige drank 5 liters, so she must be more hydrated than me. It's less about that, and it's more about your output. So keeping an eye on that day to day is really good. In regards to drinking throughout a session, it's highly, highly variable based on the athlete. So and depending on a few different factors. So body temperature, ambient temperature, how hot it is outside, how humid it is outside. What else? Sweat rate, sweat concentration. They're 2 different things that are also quite crucial. Distance, intensity, all play a massive effect. And this is the beauty of the art versus science concept, that the science says roughly per hour you should be drinking 400 to 800 milliliters per hour, so just under a liter. But again, highly variable. I know people that run a marathon and wouldn't drink 400 milliliters, and I know people that drink a lot more than that. So it's the water concept is a really, really highly variable, I'd say. And another thing that you probably need to do a little bit of trial and error on. The science suggests 400 to 800, but some days I'd take a lot less than that. Some days I'd take a lot more. So I guess take that with a bit of grain of salt to understand what works for you, and try it out in the sessions that you're doing. And so I'm just reading. I've got 2 screens, so I'm not paying attention. I'm trying to read the questions as well. So just got one from Jesse. Any specific nutrition recommendations to support women's physiology in endurance running? Is it bad for women to train fasted? I'd say no, it's not bad to train fasted. I'd probably just ask why. What's the outcome? What's the outcome that you're trying to achieve from that? Not necessarily you, but just in general. Are we trying to train our body to be in a certain way, or are we following trends because other people are doing it as well? But in terms of it being detrimental to kind of women's physiology, I wouldn't say so to a certain extent. It depends on how often you're doing that, and how intently you're doing that. But I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. But as I was saying before, training fasted, you probably don't want to make a habit of doing that every single session. You still want to be making sure that those sessions, that if you do want to train fasted at some point, that it's a long, slow session. Everything's very controlled in that environment. Just to play around with the way that your body uses its kind of fat oxidation to use fat as a fuel source. There are a lot of other variables for female athletes, and the the concept of RED-S, if anyone's ever heard of that, which is reduced energy.
Relative energy deficiency in sport.
There you go. Say it again.
Relative energy deficiency in sport.
There you go. So that concept started, the science behind that started in female athletes, where it had to do with kind of, it was called the female triad. So there was 3 different concepts of what happened in that space, and it got redefined to RED-S, which talks about reduced that energy, the amount of energy that we have available at any given time, and the more we're training, and the less fuel we're taking on board, that's when our body starts to go, okay, well, if you're still going to train at this level, at this intensity, me as my body, I've got to account for something different to make sure that if you're going to keep doing this, then I'm going to keep fueling that. But the fuel that you're actually intaking into your mouth isn't sufficient enough. So there's a lot of concepts that happen in and around that that can be detrimental. So I'd say just be cautious around fueling and making sure that, like, a lot of people that would potentially come to me would be like, okay, I want to get faster and better at running, and I want to go on a diet. And it's like what's your goal? And sometimes you can't tick off everything at the same time. It's either you want to be performance driven or you want to lose weight. And it's like, you can't always do both, because you sometimes can fall into the trap of not having enough energy for your sessions, and your body compensates. So I'd say, yeah, there are a few other elements that that female athletes need to account for. Making sure that, I mean, this is for anyone, but making sure that energy matches your demand, and that's especially for vegan or vegetarian athletes as well, to make sure that your energy density is enough for your energy output. And in regards to training fasted, probably not overall that detrimental, but if you're making a habit of it, that's probably when your body is starting to compensate for certain things. If those sessions are really long, consistent, and it's just one of those things where we don't really need to reinvent the wheel in this space. Our bodies are super efficient at burning carbohydrates, and we don't need to really modify that too much.
Yeah, I think for female athletes, the other thing, like, if you're going to do it, to be really pay a lot of attention to how your body responds to it. Because
Exactly.
I think we are a little bit more sensitive on the hormone side, and it's easy to tip things the wrong way. And when it comes to the intention of actually training fasted in terms of a fat adaptation perspective, I mean, the research is still pretty rudimentary on it, because they haven't studied females very much, because we're too hard to study, apparently. So the research, that most of the knowledge that we do have is generalized from males to females, which isn't always true, but just now we're starting to see some good scientific study on females, and so there's a lot that we really don't know, but there is some suggestion that females are already predisposed to having better abilities to burn fat over long, slow distances. And so the question comes, is it really necessary to take extra risk of training fasted and tipping your hormones out of balance to gain some fat adaptation that we really already have? But it comes down to personal preference. I know some people just plain find it hard to stomach food before running, but as we spoke about before, it's a good thing to do to train your gut to tolerate food. So it's tricky.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And the difference between male and female athletes is significant enough that, as Paige just said, it's not about there's a lot of room for research in female athletes, and even nutrition in endurance sports. When I was doing this UTA study, there's not much in the female space or the Australian space in regards to endurance intake, and I'm not sure why. Like, the females are not just small men, so we need to make sure that there's enough evidence out there so that female athletes have the ability to understand that science, and then as Paige just said, roll with that and kind of what does work for them. But yeah, there are definitely other things at play that you need to be mindful of. But yeah, you look to some certain races where female athletes are beating their male counterparts, and it's unreal to watch. And everyone's perplexed to why. And we're built slightly differently. And if in 5 or 10 years' time that does come out that training fasted or using that fat oxidation as a fuel source is more beneficial for women, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But for now, as Paige was saying, you got to weigh up the pros and the cons when you are doing that as a continuous training technique that potentially you've got to figure out whether you're doing more harm than good in any given day. And sometimes, and this is what people struggle with, it's really hard to see what your body is compensating with if you're in an energy depleted state but still having high outputs of training load. And that's really hard to see day to day in the mirror. Whereas potentially if you are worried, I'd say chat to your doctor or a dietitian and probably get some blood samples and just dive into that realm and try and understand yourself a little bit better as well, because without getting that baseline of kind of bloods, there's no one's going to be able to tell you that what's working or what's not working for you if you can't see what's happening underneath the hood, so to speak. And there's plenty of people out on the internet that will tell you exactly what you should or shouldn't do, and whether you should be listening to that advice is something completely different.
Yeah, a little bit like Jesse, I don't even know what these words are you've put in this chat here. Can you explain those a little bit?
Functional hypothalamic amenorrhea is just where women lose their periods because there's not enough energy going in, and so it mucks up their hormones that control their menstrual cycle.
Yeah, and I mean, to be perfectly honest, I haven't spoken a lot about this yet, but it will be something I talk about over the next few months. Is I've struggled with both of those, HA and REDS, and I'm not through it yet. I'm definitely in a much better place than I was in the past few years, but when it comes to training fasted, I've never trained fasted, and I definitely wouldn't get any female who's struggling with those problems to do it, because it's just an added stress, and stress is stress, whether it's training, life stress, or not feeding yourself properly. And yeah, for some people, recovery from that sort of thing can happen really fast, and for some people it takes forever, as I'm sure you figured out. And I'd say when it comes to food stuff, it's definitely better to play it safe. And luckily we are seeing some people. There's a really cool group out of Melbourne called FEMI, who are a bunch of female coaches working just with females, and they're all about using your cycle and female physiology to augment your training rather than it being a nuisance. There's also Dr. Stacey Sims, she's American, but she's done a lot of her research out of New Zealand, and she's done a lot of work looking into this sort of stuff. So there's not much out there, but it's slowly changing.
Yeah, thanks, Paige.
Yeah, and thank you both for your input on that. It's that's why these discussions are so good in this space, is to unpack a lot of these things and get perspectives of things that me myself, I've only kind of studied, that I don't have any real world experience of. So it's always good to get different perspectives of people in different spaces. I'm just going to touch on the fact that science has always been there, and we'll slowly chip away at adding onto those different scientific pieces. But in a world of information, there's a lot of people that jump on their soapbox and think that they've cured cancer and that they've got the best thing since sliced bread. And it's about being logical about how you intake that information, because science is slowly progressing, ticking things off with mainly confirmatory studies, right? They'll go, yeah, this worked, we slightly tweaked this. Whereas the outlandish, this is the only thing that will ever work for you, it doesn't really sit. It's great clickbait, and it'll always get eyes on the screen, but we really need to be quite critical thinkers when it comes to that, especially in the space of nutrition and especially in the space of endurance, because I would say that a lot of chat at the moment is around, there is a lot of chat around potentially training fasted or intermittent fasting as well. And it's not exactly helpful for a lot of people. It does have some benefits, but you really need to unpack that and discuss it. You can't just go, intermittent fasting will make you live longer. Like, it's just bizarre how people kind of clutch at straws in this science space and they just run with it. So, and I guess touching on that is I don't know if they still do it or not, but in the States, they have the Hippocratic Oath, which says that, as a doctor, when you sign up, you don't do no further harm, right? So, and that's what really bugs me about the kind of the diet culture around the world, but in Australia and kind of the Western world, is that doesn't seem to exist unless you're kind of a registered nutritional or dietitian, where you're going, I cannot give this advice because I know that if I put this information out there, people will follow it and it will potentially harm them. People don't do that. They just go, I have a platform. I think that this is what works because I've done it once. So I'm going to tell everyone about it. And then people wonder why we have this strange diet culture in 2021. And it's just bizarre. It really bugs me. But I think that the whole concept of do no harm it really sits well here in that whole kind of Instagram world, where a lot of people are talking about training faster, but it's like, is that going to do more harm than good for any given athlete, and especially a female athlete? And if that answer is no, it's not going to be beneficial, there's going to be more harm than not, then should that person be putting that information out there? And two, should we be listening to it as someone that has quite a big reach in certain spaces? So I'd always say just be critical of the way you're taking information in, regardless of where it is, but especially in nutrition, because nutrition is, I would say it's a muddy science, because we can rarely say that blueberries cause cancer. Like, we cannot, there's too many confounding variables in our life, right? We cannot lock someone away for 70 years of their life and just give them blueberries and say, well, that guy died of blueberry poisoning. I don't know. We can't do that, because there's so many aspects of our lives. So nutrition is quite a muddy science. And because of that, it's open to a lot of interpretation from people, and people just run with certain concepts, and it's bizarre.
Hey, Chapo, that's so awesome to hear, mate. Like, I've been in the world of, like, and I'm sure we all have, it's just so heavy with these influencers, whatever they want to call themselves. And it's so refreshing to hear it being put like that, because it's just like, it's a real kind of a crisis in a way that we're facing in this day and age. It's freaking not like we're getting bombed in our lives, a threat from an external thing like that, but social media and the BS that gets put out there is like heavy for a lot of people. And so I just want to say thanks for putting it out there. And I guess
sorry, go on.
I just had one question, and that was around, like, you know, companies put millions and millions of dollars into marketing every year, so you buy their product. Are there any products out there that you actually think are like legitimate and it's not all just marketing? Or do you think that, like, and I understand that some products work really well with some people and some not, but is there a brand out there that you actually like has the right values that also align with achieving the goal of like keeping people healthy?
Yeah, there's a fair bit to unpack there. Food marketing is a wild concept because what's put on the front of the packet and what's put on the back of the packet are two different things. I'd say if you're ever actually looking for advice around food or you know what's actually in stuff is to upskill yourself on how to read a food label, and that's the most boring part of the packet. But it's super valuable, and I would say that it crosses over both in public health, like day-to-day health, whether you've got a family or you know, friends that are interested in this space. Being able to read a food label and understand mainly the things you're looking at are kind of sugar, salts, and saturated fat content. You kind of can look at those, and you want to be looking at per 100 grams on the back of the label. But in saying that, when we're talking about carbohydrates before, look at the things that you're intaking during a race or during a session, and check out how many carbohydrates you have exactly in that serving size, and you'll be able to figure out your intakes across a race and narrow that down a little bit, so you know what you're intaking. So that's really beneficial. But yeah, I'm really fascinated. I eventually want to be in food policy. I'm in kind of health policy at the moment, day to day, but food policy is a really interesting space because industry regulation around kind of food marketing sits with a lot of people on the industry board, and the way that I relate that is kind of like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. It's not good. It's not beneficial for us, right? It's not gonna. They're gonna say, yeah, we'll try and regulate this and try and regulate that, but it's voluntary, and that doesn't really matter. So, you know, you take products that say light on it, like it's light could mean in color, could mean in flavor, could be in looks. Like it has nothing to do with the fat content. Yet people, and it's called a health halo, is when the front of the packet says like holistic and natural and all this sort of stuff. Flick over to the back label, like that's what will tell you the truth because it's regulated. That's the only part that's regulated, is the nutrition information panel and the ingredients list. And the health halo around foods is that, and there's plenty of health halos around at the moment where it'll say all these amazing things, and I'd say like things like a protein bar is a really good example of that, where people assume as soon as it says like protein bar, they go, this thing is healthy. This thing is just straight away healthy because it's a protein bar. It has to be healthy. Everyone else is eating them. But what else is in that? Like, what's the saturated fat content? What's the sugar content of those things? Like, people are throwing these down like they're going out of fashion, and it's some of them have higher sugar content than a chocolate bar. Like that's what a health halo is. So food marketing is a really interesting space, and it does influence behavior and food choice a lot. But in coming back to your question in regards to products that potentially would work in that space, I don't know. There's a lot that does work, but I know Paige is a big advocate for oats, and I'd say I am too. I pretty much nominate them for most of my clients. That they are super cheap. They are packed with fiber, carbohydrates. Like they are bang for buck. They're one of the better things that we can eat, and because they don't have that marketing spin around them, they just sit on the shelf, right? It's like they cost like $2 for a big packet of oats. It's like we miss out on all this because we want all those buzzwords on our packet, and people miss the point. They're looking for those buzzwords, and sometimes it's the cheaper, more nutritious foods that's sitting right next to it that we never get to. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Is there any other questions that are kind of burning at this point? I know that nutrition is such a broad space and you can jump down a lot of different rabbit holes for it, but I could honestly talk about it all day.
I think a good point to wrap up on was something that Felicity dropped into the chat box, was about the constant information telling us what to do and what to eat robs us of the joy and magic of listening to your own body's feedback and doing your own experiments. And I think that's a really good point to finish up on. Like, there's all this information, and as long as you're eating enough and you can, if you're an athlete and you're running and you feel like you have enough energy and you're supporting your running, it really comes back to what makes you feel good and what you enjoy eating. If someone else really likes oats and you don't like oats, then you don't have to eat oats. Like, there is plenty out there and there's no one right way to do it, as Mick was saying before about it being an art. So yeah, I think wrapping up, like, basically before you run, stick to carbs are king. Fun fact is that you can't burn fats without carbs anyway, and your brain can't use fats, so you always need some carbs. During training and after training, and how much you drink is super individual, and the best thing to do is to learn how to listen to your own body. But yeah, if you've got any questions, I'm sure that Mick could be happy to take them on during the session or after the session. He's got his contacts up there. But yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. Mick, have you got anything else to say?
No, I think that's it. It's as I said, it's a very broad topic in regards to nutrition, and everyone has a vested interest in it, which is unreal. But also, it does create that space where everyone has their 2 cents on what it is. But a really good analogy is just because you're a frequent flyer doesn't mean you can fly the plane. So a lot of people out there, like, we eat food every single day, but just because we eat food doesn't give people, just because someone's lost weight doesn't give them the nutritional knowledge to give advice on how to lose weight. That's anecdotal evidence for them, which may have worked for them, which is great. But when people start to kind of exacerbate that or push those messages further and further, it can be quite dangerous. So yeah, just because you're a frequent flyer doesn't mean you can fly the plane, is what I always refer to as people sprouting nutrition advice when potentially it's not there. But yeah, hopefully you guys got something beneficial out of that. As I said, there's a lot to unpack with public health nutrition as well as performance nutrition. So if you've got more questions, yeah, reach out to Paige or myself, and yeah, happy to answer them.
Yeah, super good. Oh, and Linda just dropped one of my favorite sandwich combinations in there, or toast, is Vegemite and peanut butter. And everyone screws up their nose when I say that, but try it. And Madge also got me onto Vegemite and hummus a few years ago. Another one.
Right.
Surprisingly good.
I have to
Yeah.
try it.
And everything.
Yeah.
Vegemite and everything. So good.
Yeah, avocado.
Avocado, Vegemite.
Yeah.
Tahini and Vegemite. Bars and Vegemite.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Chapo.
All
Thanks.
good. Thanks, guys. Enjoy.
See ya.
See you later. Thanks so much.